And hello, this is the Freedom Anarchist News Review. With me tonight, I have Uri and Andy, and we are talking about, in rough order, Israel versus Iran and the neocon hot flush. HS2 costs are rising again, despite the supposed killing of it. The Kneecap court case, changes to abortion laws, the push to ban regulation of AI in the US, and Amazon under attack um, from direct actionists. So starting off with in Germany, sadly not. I say sadly not in the UK. Obviously, wouldn't be advocating for such a thing in the UK.
We just report the news.
Everywhere else in the world, fantastic business. In the UK, it's not supposed to happen. In but also in international news. So Israel versus Iran and the neocon hot flush uh, has been a not entirely unpredictable event, but obviously an unwelcome one and in many ways shocking, not least because our very own neocon media has gone completely off the rails, demanding that regime change should happen in Iran. It feels like 2003 all over again. Um, Uri, what do you
Well,
reckon
I mean,
to
the first thing I
cover?
usually say is this isn't about regime change, it's about regime preservation, right? And I mean, whoever thinks the war between Israel and Iran won't just strengthen the regimes in both countries, still needs to learn something about how these things work. Treaties bring peace, or treaties save lives at least, and wars save politicians. That was the watchword at a demo in Haifa, Israel, the other day. And you know but if you think the way the mainstream media in this country is aligning with these goals of the attack, then you wouldn't believe what's going on in Israel. And that's the real headfuck for me, right? That the same journalists that 3 days before the attack started were saying Netanyahu is extending the war in Gaza for his own political survival and he's turning the world against us and all of that. Suddenly, with the Air Force attacks on Iran, the national erection is again at full mast. Excuse me, excuse my French, but it's
Quite the
it's
image.
really the like you could understand how that happened, after the trauma of the 7th of October. But now this is like so transparent. Now, I want us to notice the kind of double and triple game here, right? The official line of the Israeli government is that this is an attack on Iran's nuclear capabilities, that the point of no return has arrived. It's about, stopping their nuclear program. But the political class and the right wing and Netanyahu supporters, of course, are always amplifying this other point. No, it's actually about regime change in Iran. We want to destroy the Ayatollah regime, which is all Israelis know about. You know, Iran, a huge, vibrant country with many different cultures and languages and everything. All they know is Ayatollah regime. About the Jewish Ayatollah regime, they're willing to give it a pass. Now, and Western media then goes on and echoes that broader war purpose even beyond what is being officially declared by the Israeli government. All right. So, I mean, you have rogue spokespeople who are talking about regime change openly, but it's interesting that the sort of there's the official line, then there's the broadened line about regime change, and we can talk about whether that might entice in the United States to get involved. Um, and then there's the actual function that war performs, right, for both regimes, which is mainly a matter of internal loyalty. Um, and the only real difference is that in Iran, they need to apply more repression because, on average, the people are less loyal to the government in Iran than in Israel at this time, it would seem to me. Maybe I'm wrong. Now, as this goes on, of course, we can't let our eyes off Gaza, where the explicit starvation policy is continuing day by day, where Air Force attacks are also continuing day by day. I mean, there have been hundreds of civilians killed in Iran, and that is drawn attention. There's also been civilians killed in Israel, but in Gaza, it is still going on, and this is becoming more and more about, well, Vernichtung durch Hunger, I hate to say it, annihilation via starvation. What is not an official policy of the Israeli government, but is certainly the desire and wish of its most extreme elements and some of its, most vocal supporters on the social media. And the ease with which calls for genocide, let alone ethnic cleansing, fly off people's lips and are absorbed in social media, where it seems that it's quite easy to veil them, at least in Hebrew, in ways that will not get censure, continues to be completely corrosive, mainly of my faith in other human beings, to be honest. But there is this, we mustn't take our eyes off Gaza. And I think, the way in which in the week just before the attack on Iran started, we saw, and this was in the news in a while, and then it got superseded, the Maldin, the Global March to Gaza, attempts, okay, partly for the camera, partly futile, but still significant, to show we are here, we are still resisting. Um, there is at least some humanity left of people who are actually willing to put, their freedom on the line, in order to show at least that some people still want to prevent mass starvation, to prevent ethnic cleansing, um, in this living hell of the Gaza Strip. So I think it's extremely significant for us as radicals in the West, who are not threatened by our regimes, who are not threatened at the moment by other regimes, to continue to speak out, to continue to draw attention to this. Um, and I think it has to be a matter of time. And this is spoken as an anarchist, but I think it has to be a matter of time before there are actual sanctions on the Israeli state, from European countries, from Britain. This is something that is remains the only significant lever, just in order to stop this continuing killing, and perhaps also allow Israeli people to reclaim a bit of agency in toppling their own regime, the way that everybody somehow expects the Iranians to do, or the Gazans to do, right? All of these sanctions, all of these pressures are always justified with the idea that they are supposed to make it hard enough for the people to rise up against the regime. Well, I think the Israeli public was perhaps just on the verge of starting to do that in a meaningful way, when the October 7th attacks happened. And, part of why that was such a disaster was because that was a point at which already things like the anti-occupation bloc had gained a mainstay within sort of the mainstream Israeli anti-government demonstrations. And, but it's just tragic. And I don't think that we have a plausible way out of that without external pressure on Israel. Um, this sort of immediate jumping to attention has really been proven to be the undoing of the Jewish Israeli polity, most strongly now with this attack on Iran.
That's very well summarised. Anything to add, Andy? Um,
Okay, let's look on the positive thing. Britain hasn't actually joined the war yet. If Starmer gets told by someone that Churchill did change the Iranian regime in 1943, then he probably will join the war. So people should be careful that that doesn't leak out. Um, with Trump, I mean, as he said himself today, I don't know what I'm going to do. And that is, for once, perfectly true. God only knows. It's very difficult to see a conclusion to this because historically it's extremely difficult to bomb a regime into surrender purely by bombing without using nuclear weapons. Let's pause that thought before we go too far. There, there are exceptions on wars being won without actually a ground occupation. Britain's defeat of Zanzibar in 1898 springs to mind, where the Navy bombarded the Sultan's capital for 40 minutes until he surrendered.
reaching away back there.
But they are unusual. Usually, you've got to go in and actually occupy, and that is simply not on the cards with a country as big as Iran in current circumstances. And you can see Iran's ability to actually hit back degraded to the point where there is just an ongoing occasional bombing of them. But in the long run, that just leaves a matter of time until they can carry out terrorist attacks across the world against the great Satan and its acolytes, and that will be no good for anything. Toppling the Iranian regime, and I don't like it at all, is not going to solve that particular problem because any popular democratic regime in Iran will be anti-Israel and anti-America for all foreseeable future, as far as I can tell. Unless an anarchist global revolution's on the cards, we are looking at quite a long-term disaster.
I mean, I would have thought that, I think the rhetoric of regime change is, I mean, certainly from Israel's end, it's just that, right? It's like a excuse, and from the end of Europe and America, I imagine there is an element of, oh yes, we'd quite like that to happen, but realistically, if you did, and toppling a regime by bombing it tends to go the other way in terms of it tends to unite the public in the same way as Israel, as the Knesset unites the Israeli public behind it by saying we are under attack and you need to unite behind us. The Iranian government will do the same, right?
I
So
mean,
governments always work in wartime.
what's really striking is the degree to which this is a replay of the Iraq War, right? In 2002-3, where it started from weapons of mass destruction and moved to the rhetoric of regime change. And this is being echoed now without people being aware that that's what they're echoing. But I mean, the chance of American boots on the ground in Iran is very small. I mean, there is no way. I mean, it's just too stupid, right? Especially when in the US, like we mentioned, right, we do still have a lot of that neocon establishment within, the defense apparatus, especially, among senior Republican advisors who would still hold to that line of projecting American power in the world. But on the other hand, it's very clear that Trump's America Firstism is in an explicit sort of reference to, you know, earlier iterations of isolationism, right, 120 years ago, and so on, and really to expect that his own partners and handlers, i.e., the tech sector that has jumped to the right, yeah, is going to go along with the military industries, the oil industries, in trying to push the U.S. towards that, is very, very small. I mean, there isn't even much that can be gained objectively in terms of strengthening American capitalism from doing this. Okay, so yeah, wars deplete stocks of weapons, and those weapons need to be replenished. And that is, it's that point which is going to determine when this becomes economically no longer attractive for the United States. In Israeli media, there are all of these fantasies about, the US supplying or using this ultimate bunker buster Moab thing, the strongest thing short of a nuclear weapon to attack some of those very deep underground Iranian facilities, which have probably been evacuated to secondary sites at this point. I mean, come on, these people have contingency plans. But I mean, I think at this point, I hope at this point that it's more about Israeli fantasy, because there is, like, for Israel to drag the world into a world war today, that would be like just it would be too much like the Israeli regime actually trying to fulfill anti-Semitic fantasies. There's a dynamic there where they really do it because, and this is the other thing I wanted to say. Iran is not going to attack, British government targets or American government targets, or it's going to attack Jewish civilian targets around the world, right? This is going to make Jews around the world much less safe. And that works in the interest of the Israeli regime because its only raison d'etre is that this is a safe place for Jews. Well, look how fucking safe it is now, right? And so there is this absolutely pathological dynamic here, where Netanyahu and the far right have a penchant for trying to, and I don't know if they get what they're doing, but it really is as if they're trying to embody anti-Semitic fantasies. Maybe it's because they've been rubbing shoulders with these far-right anti-Semites for so many years, right? And like Trump's exiting the nuclear agreement with Iran, okay? That was, I mean, of course he would have done that because among the various outrageous things that he immediately set out to do in 2016. But part of the reason for that is that especially the religious right wing of the Republican Party has been, in this very strong alliance with everyone from Netanyahu and to the right, the settler movement, the sort of messianic immanentists, the people who would bomb the Temple Mount, God knows what. Right? They have gone into this long-term project of cultivating their alliance with the global far right and especially the American far right, where they fancy themselves the puppet masters, as if they are just keen on realizing these anti-Semitic fantasies. But in truth, the tail doesn't wag the dog. Okay, Israel might be the empire's Death Star, as we said but it's not the capital in Coruscant. Yeah, the emperor isn't Netanyahu, it's Trump. Sorry to stretch these metaphors, but look, the ultimate point of all of this is death and suffering and starvation and dehumanization. And it's very hard to remain even sensitized to all of that as the news cycle just runs and runs and runs. And I guess that's the other thing. It's not just about continuing to resist. It's also about staying human through all of it and continuing to be able to feel through all of it, which is very difficult when we're isolated and alone. And that's why we need our communities of resistance to support each other through it. New
Speaking of,
topic.
speaking of communities of resistance, so we have two probably well-connected topics to move on to. One of which is a mild bit of good news, which is alongside the various protests in favour of Kneecap, the court case has gone through a little bit, and he has been bailed for with I think unconditional bail after appearing on a terror charge. So congratulations to Kneecap and indeed Liam. Interesting that a terror charge would have unconditional bail, I feel. Doesn't really suggest that they think that he is a genuine threat to the safety and well-being of society around him. But
I mean,
yeah,
that's exactly a testament to the cheapening of anti-terrorist legislation, right? And the way it's just being used to stifle perhaps unsavory expressions, but not ones that actually endanger anyone. And I think, in this country, it's maybe not as bad as it is already in a country like Germany, where, Jewish anti-occupation activists who are there as Jews can also at this point get arrested. But I think that there is this country still has some decent buffers when it comes to the policing of speech. But like we said a few weeks ago, I think those buffers are applied differently to the left and to the right. I think that's the key thing, isn't it?
two tiers, etc., etc. I mean, yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
The idea that flying the wrong flag would lumber you with a terror charge is, I mean, it's not unheard of, and I think it connects strongly to the kind of the way the British establishment tends to work around things like free speech and the right to protest has historically tended to work on the principle that if it's not a serious threat to us, we won't be too bothered unless it becomes particularly inconvenient or something which shows up on the telly and King Charles doesn't we don't want King Charles to see it, such as Republic or some such. But on the whole, we'll give a certain amount of leeway on the grounds of free speech because it allows for a non-damaging escape valve for dissent. Something which was broken down in the latter part of the Tories' stewardship of Westminster and has not really been repealed by Labour since. But there is still, as you say, there's vestiges of the old system still in place, and I think the judiciary tends to be slightly more on board with those still than the politicians are. Although, I mean, as Andy will almost certainly be able to give endless case studies as to why that isn't the case.
I mean, this is something to stay on the lookout for in this country because, it's quite different the way that judges, prosecutors get appointed here than how they might get appointed, in Europe, let alone the US. But, I think it's different in the sense that in this country, the far right is not yet, or maybe can never go on a mission to capture the key institutions like the judiciary, like the military, right? Like I mean, because on the one, like, still a lot of the culture, a lot of the press is already in its hands, and of course, the owning class is very much, a sort of conservative constituency. But that's something that I guess for whatever reason distinguishes Britain from elsewhere. Maybe simply the ruling class here is sitting much more safely.
I mean, it always has to a great degree. In Britain, historically, obviously being the original heart of empire, grew into itself or into its modern incarnation with a certain level of uh, confidence in its own position that I think does reflect certainly in a section of the ruling class and how it approaches the world. And the judiciary is historically has been sort of part of that section of the ruling class, essentially the old aristocracy shading into kind of the 19th century
Patrician.
industrialists and patriot. Yeah, exactly. Um, and there is that kind of yes minister stability, or at least the ends of it. I think it is slowly dissipating, and it is, you can see big institutions like the BBC being captured over time, with people being swapped out as and when the opportunity arises, with people who are more nakedly partisan on a kind of wing of the Tories that is more interventionist. And which is more prepared to put in people like Farage regularly on, certainly on Question Time. You see him all the time, because, I mean, Farage doesn't fit with an awful lot of the British ruling class's ideas, in as much as he wears the clothes and he has the accent, and he actually comes from roughly the same background, but he's kind of considered a bit gauche in many circles, I think.
And his voters too.
Yeah, and
I mean,
absolutely,
the
actually,
elite look
probably,
down on reform voters.
yeah, and actually, probably he is considered more gauche because his support base is considered, lower class or lower grade or whatever, and that has a weird protective aspect in terms of which way the ruling class jumps, I suppose. It tends to prefer to stick with a kind of relaxed conservatism rather than shouty Trumpist style stuff, I
I mean,
suppose.
at the same time, there's, at least in the last, well, post-war period, certainly since the fall of the Soviet Union, that rise of the much more securitist, militarist, NATO participating part of it. We talked about how Starmer's main thing is going to be about playing the adult in the room to Trump and promoting himself, and Britain as sort of, like a stronger, more important member in NATO. And I think, when it comes to the kind of things that the government has been at least outwardly emphasizing, our expectations have been borne out. The militarist side of things has indeed become their way of essentially not making any significant changes to the fairness of the country internally.
Yep.
Yeah,
Andy
so
got
quickly on the kneecap one, the Crown Prosecution Service had the option of charging him with Section 12 of the Terrorism Act 2000 for supporting Hezbollah, which would have given him a jury trial and has a maximum 15-year sentence. So they went for the Section 13, in which you've just displayed an item such as it would be likely that someone would believe that you're showing support. It's a much lower test and is also tried only in the magistrates' court. In theory, it's imprisonable, but we have had recent cases for Palestine, and before that, cases for Kurdistan and supporters of the PKK. They've been getting conditional discharges and told to go on their way afterwards. It is exactly as you say, the judiciary is that kind of institution that you have to be, one, well off to get into because it has got a very long training period. Even though the salaries at the high end are great, you are not going to become a judge by just turning up and saying you'd like to be one. You've got to toe the line for 30 years and follow tradition to get there. Same applies to the military as well in this country. You can't get far as an officer unless you've got your own money to get through the subaltern years. And so, yeah, they're just sitting there saying, right, we'll go through the motions, and that will, and hopefully no one will get excited if no one goes to jail, and that will stop any big protests about the kneecap thing, because unless there is a perceived massive injustice, it's just something that's happened and is probably good because it's getting publicity for the supposed clampdown without anyone having to suffer for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely. I mean, I have no doubt that the fact that kneecaps immense immediate popularity off the back of this, and the protests have had some kind of impact on what's been being discussed um, around them. Because yeah, the last thing they want is um, a very popular musical group to, historically that kind of thing tends to metastasize in protest terms. Um, uh, Moving on to in fact, an article which has gone up fairly just now on the Freedom News website, and this is anti-militarists claim arson of Amazon and Deutsche Telekom vehicles, with Amazon being targeted for complicity in Israel's Gaza genocide, Telecom for cooperation with the German military, and Elon Musk's Starlink. There's a whole communique which is worth delving into. This is mostly just a mention, but it's
I mean, I
interesting
think
that.
one thing worth mentioning is that it's not that rare. I mean, okay, so this is a lot of vehicles at one time, but the stat I saw was that, in 2020, 2021, there was a total of 400 arsons in Germany alone. 2021, if you count other cars that were damaged alongside the ones that were targeted, and I'm sure that the people who did it are very sorry about that. You get 700 in the year. So this is something that that we first of all, I think it's important to emphasize that these are actions in which no people were hurt. These are actions that plainly intended to cause economic damage to the companies in order to pressure them to cease their participation in complicity with military interests, and taking that a couple of notches down, even on the level of militants. Then in this country, we've had paint actions and lock-on actions, and something that's extremely fluffy and accountable in comparison. And that has also been getting the goods, lobbyists, other, infrastructural supporters of arms companies like Elbit, who are directly responsible for the murder of civilians, have stopped working with them on the back of this pressure. And, I think that it's impossible to say that these actions are more immoral than their targets, and these I think that by the standards of the levels of violence and destruction and death that are being meted out by states in the world right now, we can see that the the impact of militant and maybe destructive but non-violent actions in which no one is hurt can be significant. And that's why that's our way.
I think it's actually there's an interesting line to draw across the Atlantic with this stuff. That's increasingly people are targeting big tech, uh, particularly vehicles. So obviously, Waymos were very infamously being burned during the LA confrontations, and
Teslas.
I Teslas have been attacked repeatedly all around the world, in fact. And I wonder whether this is an open door that is being gently pushed at, both in terms of the public, who don't really like big tech, although we all have to work with it because mostly we don't get an option, but also with a large section of the ruling class. Because one of the things that big tech has been doing is um, not just pushing working class people into penury or out of work or into constant little micro payments to this to all to the same um, handful of big firms, but also have been pushing uh, traditional businesses and traditional sections of the ruling class out of their positions of power. Tesla, for example, has something like 30 times the market cap of Ford, despite the fact that its actual production is something like a third of Ford's, right?
Yeah, I still don't think the board of directors of Ford are looking at Tesla's burning and saying, "Oh yeah, come on, give it to him."
I
I think the
wouldn't be
working class,
entirely
ruling
surprised if
class
they were
does
relaxed.
recoil.
I don't think they're enthusiastic, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were quite relaxed about the whole thing.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't agree with that because I think it's, I think any show of offensive from the bottom up is going to concern the ruling class across all its sectors. I mean, I would suspect something more sinister, whether, it's going to be this sort of new buffer, new vent, if you will, since public protest and just street actions are being so contained. Maybe the system will just let this become a new vent, damage to property doesn't hurt anybody, gives the kind of people who read freedom an occasional feeling of, whatever it is, empowerment or whatever you want, but ultimately functional, for the stability of the system. At least it's targeting things in a way that is, again, small cell, unaccountable, doesn't do a lot to build mass movements that are embedded in what is left of working class communities. This is not to condemn any more than to and of course not to approve those kind of actions, but ultimately they can also be in some way co-opted, fundamentally. Um, the other thing to point out is the way in which there's a really strange realignment of the owning class in the US. Because, throughout the century that we've been through, you could see quite easily how these two sections of American capital, right? The high tech and finance section and the arms and oil section, just to put it in very crude terms, were sort of the puppeteers of the Republican and Democratic parties, respectively, right? So it was very clear that the move from the Clinton administration to the Bush 2 administration had to do exactly with that kind of move of the balance, the swing of the pendulum between those two sections, significant sections of American capital. What we have now is the finance and high tech sections siding with the Republicans, right? Amazon was a major sponsor of Trump's military parade the other week. A company, these are, and to say nothing of Musk and Tesla. Okay, they've had their fallouts and so on and so forth, but it's not as if Musk is suddenly going to go and support maybe a different section of the Republican Party. I don't know about that, but he seems so wedded to the idea of white farmers that I don't think he's leaving the Trump wing of the Republican Party anytime soon. This kind of, I think part of it is that a lot of this kind of new generation of people in the finance and high tech sectors are also strongly wedded to masculinist ideologies, to this sort of far right techno utopianism, slightly eugenic, you know, planet colonizing fantasies. Peter Thiel as well, right? And in that way, they're sort of converging with some of what's been happening in the military and paramilitary industries, the security companies, the Blackwaters, all of these kind of. So I think there is like the toxic masculinity that has been valorized and celebrated, in the last 20 years is one of the keys to understanding that surface political transition of the American working class. But I think Marxists are going to be better at talking about that than me.
I mean, I wouldn't disagree with almost all of that. I suppose the bit that I'm interested in terms of ruling class conflicts is that I think that an awful lot of what you're describing, the kind of um, macho free cities essentially owned and run by tech, um, by your Ayn Rand super people. Um, I think that puts them in de facto conflict with sections of the existing ruling class, like essentially the older fashioned ruling class. So, we were talking about that ruling class in the UK, which is much more um, overt and settled and part of an acknowledged cultural field within Britain. But that does exist in the US as well. It's just more masked, like the kinds of people who went to Harvard and Yale and Princeton and who make up the core of sort of older fashioned industries, I suppose. They are in some ways being kind of pushed aside or um, shoveled into a kind of mold for a future that is being foreseen by the tech bros. And they're not all terribly happy about it. I mean, you do see them arguing and kind of, bucking against this whole project now and again. And I think the interesting sudden resurgence of neocon um, terminology around Iran is an example
Regime
of that.
change.
These people haven't disappeared. They're just kind of. It's an interesting thing when you read the FT, obviously favorite paper of Freedom Press.
You got to
That
know what they're writing.
yeah, is that they will occasionally bring out an article which talks about what the trad section of the American ruling class is up to. And a lot of it is quietly lobbying away ideas that are being put forward by the techno class. Not always
That's
very
really
successfully.
interesting because the Wall Street Journal also over the last couple of days was running pieces about, how how the Iranians want to surrender or negotiate or sort of become part of Trump's big beautiful Middle East designs. And the Wall Street Journal, which again, is in a way like the FT. It's sort of a weather vane of the owning class. So I think that's very interesting to see that happening on both sides of the Atlantic.
Yes, which
Well,
leads us to unless Andy has additionals to say.
can we talk about the weather? No, I have
And it
a
being
serious
hot.
question. What's gonna happen? Like, is there a point where like the yield of making conversation about the weather more interesting is outweighed by the dread of the meaning of it all? And there's a sense in which people here are gonna just be talking about the weather even as they crawl for the last bit of drinking water, like it's an inevitability. I'm just fascinated by this because like the whole point of the weather is that it's supposed to be a non-controversial, safe topic for discussion, right? What happens when talking about the weather actually becomes talking about climate change? I'm just curious. Maybe there's no answers for that tonight.
I think there is a section of the British public that will quite literally be burning alive and still saying climate changes all the time. It's just, that's just a thing that happens.
There's something about the inevitability of the weather also that speaks to a public that has been sort of beaten into discipline through about 1,000 years of military occupation, uh, which is how I see this country as one that's still under occupation since at least 1066. Oh well, we won't solve those problems tonight.
Yeah, one thing that Trump and Elon managed with Doge is they have cutting down on the satellite measurement of Arctic sea ice, which is one of my favourite little websites, the National Oceanographic Service. Yeah, so you won't be able to see that the polar bears are melting now.
That
Or
must mean
not
it
Follow
isn't
suit.
happening. If you can't see it, it's not happening.
Another
That's the
difficulty
Trump method.
solved by big tech. Cracking. On the subject of big tech, so we'll probably do this. We've got two more to cover very briefly as we are getting on for time again. So there is a push to ban regulation of AI in the US. So this is connecting directly to what we were just talking about. Perfect segue. Well done, everybody. And the the nuts and bolts of it is that this is coming up as part of the big beautiful bill, and I still cannot believe that we have to call it that. But it's being lobbied for by the usual subjects. This is a trade group in Compass, which has started the AI Competition Centre, and the basic logic of it is in order for US AI to remain competitive, it has to be completely unregulated. Obviously, from a UK perspective, what happeneth in the US happeneth to the UK. So it's probably worth, for people who are campaigning on don't let the UK government give away all of our details all at once to any AI company that comes calling. This is probably coming down the road for us as well, I would imagine.
I think there is one thing that really strikes me about AI, or at least about large language models, is the way in which people sometimes attributed this oracle quality. Like there is still a need, a very deep-seated need in people to access something that can purport to a neutrality, to some kind of all-knowing quality, and I think that the extremely extended hype over AI, gives voice to some of that. At the same time, while this thing is producing uncannily creepy art, and I'm personally also quite shocked with the ease with which a lot of, anarchist Facebook pages, Instagram accounts, and so on are using that, fake AI images of Bakunin illustrating some translated passage moved around as, relatable content and so on. The really bad side of it is that, the use of AI for military purposes, where it becomes as crude as it is for writing, you know, some student essays that I've had to flag up lately and other kind of stuff, right? That is just invading everywhere. And part of the story again is Amazon, right? So Amazon Web Services together with Google and Microsoft. I've set up this sort of network, Nimbus, that has been providing a lot of computing capacity to the Israeli military, to the American military, to NATO forces. Um, and I think that, this is something that we will only, if ever, know the extent of decades hence, is the way in which the use of crude AI technology has allowed for such masses of civilian deaths in Gaza. And these were the systems at the back of bombing down entire high rises because some, sergeant major in Hamas was thought to live in one of the flats, and they just killed tens of people, just like that. This is the real issue with AI, not those disgusting memes that everybody's spreading. I mean, the texts, I still can tell when a text is AI generated. I mean, it's just too easy, especially after you've read so much student work that behind your back has been. Sorry, I teach. That's what I do for money. But it's the death. It's the real bodies being crushed under rubble that matter here, much more than our identities, much more than the fakakte art that is, yeah, I mean, that's also going to get people out of work. A lot of what AI can do, basic level programming, other stuff, of course, it's going to change the way that capitalism does things. And I think it's stupid to ignore it. I think we're kind of too weak to take a completely abolitionist stance against it. But these are not just server farms, right? They have companies. Those companies have offices. Yeah, those offices have locks, and so on and so forth, or at least a pavement in front where you can stand up with a sign still, without getting picked up and thrown into an unmarked van.
And there's
And
very
that's where
much,
it lies.
we are very much in the precise moment in which the big server farms which are being planned for Britain are being planned now. At this very moment, they are selecting land, they are looking into where they can draw the abstract water from. They are, lobbying the government to give them free rein to basically rob all of our water right now. And yeah, there is plenty that can be done to undermine the oncoming AI dominance of Britain if
Connect them
people
to the
get on it.
effluent that's coming into the rivers
Yeah.
instead, right? That should work.
But yeah, like it's I would absolutely agree that the faffing about with people writing people's essays and doing silly artwork or even silly videos, it's all very much a kind of playpen stuff in comparison to what is actually, I never watched, if there was one movie I didn't expect to be um, worryingly prescient, it was Captain America Winter Soldier with height. If you haven't seen it, the basic premise is that Hydra, the bad guys, use a hyper advanced AI to start selecting targets for the big heli carriers to shoot from on high en masse and target. And what you were describing in Gaza is essentially that without the heli carriers, right? It's near enough exactly the same process. So we are now living in a bizarre hinterland in which MCU movies are predicting the future. Who knew that was going to happen? But yeah, like the single most terrifying thing, in my view, about the way that AI is going is that Palantir and its uh, you know parallel companies are going to have so much information on us and the ability to manipulate it in such black box ways that we're going to have absolutely, we've always had a dramatic information deficit against the state. That's always been a problem that we've had. And what AI will do is supercharge that deficit to the point where we will have absolutely no way of catching up unless, we find a way of utilizing AI ourselves. And I am unclear as to how we would do that without having access to the same enormous server farms and secure server farms that the government would. It's a terrifying time, and putting it off for as long as possible should probably be something of a priority.
Well, hey, what do you know? Maybe we're all gonna get a nuclear war long before that becomes a concern. It's certainly going that way, you know? Let that be your optimistic note to end on
Maybe they
this
can't
time.
run the AI because there just won't be enough water left. That's also. Um, we can leave with a slight up in as much as, or quite a good up actually, the push to ban or reduce regulation of abortion in the UK, which I believe Andy has a bit of background on.
Yeah, it's good, but it's not great because there was an amendment passed that women who have an abortion beyond the time limits will no longer be prosecuted. This is good news. It did not go as far as we would have hoped. There was another amendment, the Stella Creasy one, to actually repeal sections 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Person Act 1861, and indeed the Infant Life Preservation Act of 1929, all up to date stuff, as you know. So the difficulty that remains is that although women can no longer be prosecuted, if they get assistance, then those people who help can. It puts it very much in the situation where we are with suicide. You can't be prosecuted anymore for trying to commit suicide, but if you get medical help to do it, then they can be prosecuted.
Yeah, with the only difference that the person committing suicide is a living, viable human being, right? It's not an embryo.
Yeah,
That's the difference. But, and that's, I think, isn't this one of those other sort of ways in which the law tends to like to leave things in a gray area? I mean, it's a bit like, what we talked about before. I guess it is.
Sorry, I was expecting Andy to respond to that. Yeah.
No,
I mean,
absolutely. It's a classic fudge and compromise because they knew that it will be controversial. It is a very strange way to have brought it about, to stick it in the amendment of an entirely separate act without any previous publicity or public debate. So that is an easy way for opponents to attack this measure. But I assume that it will simply go through. And for if you're looking for one more positive thing for the day, it is the 26th anniversary of J18, the Carnival Capital protest in the City of London, which I think, as someone said to me at the time, remember that these big protests are just the icing on the cake, the stodgy cake of workplace and community organisation that needs a layer of marzipan of political organising in order to get the excitement that comes of going out on the streets.
Amen.
Excellently tortured analogy to end on. Thank you very much, both of you, for as ever, fascinating conversation. And I would, as ever, urge people to go to freedomnews.org.uk for the various excellent writings there. So good night all.